Good evening. My name is Ksenia McCoskey, and I am a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues here at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many Indigenous peoples that lived with these lands, as well as the thousands of Indigenous children first into the Carlisle Area Industrial School starting in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum, Dickinson College, and the Popel Shaw Center for Race and Ethnicity, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Antiracism and its Discontents, the pros and cons of anti-racist activism in America. A month ago, the Clark Forum welcomed 3 panelists to discuss what critical race theory, also known as CRT, is and is not, and how educators can teach a 21st century holistic view of US history regarding slavery and racism. This panel certainly did not solve the CRT debate, and perhaps left the Dickinson College community with more questions about the nuance of CRT and how it is being confused with teaching history in public school systems. Since our last panel, it has also become apparent that the cultural wars over CRT are not dying down. In fact, just a few weeks ago, Senator Ted Cruz questioned Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson on her view of the 1619 Project and her position as a board member at the Georgetown Day School, where Senator Cruz believes CRT is being taught. What is clear from this interaction on Capitol Hill is that the CRT culture war is not disappearing anytime soon. Even though some educators and academics have insisted that CRT is an advanced academic theory that is not appropriate for K-12 education, it has turned into a polarizing national issue. Many argue that CRT is a discriminatory and divisive ideology that, if taught in schools, will divide children based on their race, not unite them. CRT debates have become so intense in some parts of the US that parents and community members have flocked to school board meetings demanding book burnings and censorship on curriculum that discusses conscious and unconscious bias, privilege, discrimination, and oppression. State legislation acting on instilling parameters on school curriculum has also been introduced in several states, including in Pennsylvania. Our own state representative, Barb Gleim, believes that CRT is already being taught in public schools in Pennsylvania and has introduced House Bill 1532 to ban CRT and any other sexist or racist concepts from Commonwealth public schools. Tonight's program will continue to enhance the complexity of CRT and further the discussion of how the US should pursue racial equality. One of Dickinson's main objectives is to develop educated leaders who have their own perspective on critical debates and can use their voices to shape the world. After all, Benjamin Rush, Dickinson College's founder, wrote that freedom can exist only in the society of knowledge. To have a society that is truly free and values knowledge, we must listen and provide spaces for divergent perspectives. Even today, however, we are recontextualizing and reevaluating historical figures like Rush, and specifically what our founders' views on slavery and race mean in the 21st century. Nevertheless, reflection on US history and historical figures and contemporary culture wars on CRT are all intertwined. And to fulfill Rush's vision of a society of knowledge, we must listen to all sides of an argument. Here to present an alternative argument on anti-racist activism is Erec Smith. Smith is the Associate Professor of Rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania. His research concentrates on anti-racist activism, theory, and pedagogy. Most recently, Smith has been a vocal critic of the claim that standard English perpetuates white supremacy and racism. His new books include The Lure of Disempowerment, Reclaiming Agency in the Age of CRT, and A Critique of Anti-Racism and Rhetoric and Composition, The Semblance of Empowerment. A strong advocate for diversity of thought within the Black and academic community, Smith is the co-founder of Free Black Thought, a nonprofit organization and website that is dedicated to showcasing diverse Black voices, which are rarely presented in the media. He is also a writing fellow for the Heterodox Academy, a nonpartisan collaboration of educators, administrators, staff, and students committed to encouraging diverse viewpoints on college campuses. Smith is a supporter of classical liberal concepts of social justice and serves as an advisor for several organizations that strive to de-escalate political polarization. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion, expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speakers and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, please know that handicap accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. And now, please join me in welcoming Professor Erec Smith.
Sometimes I forget all the stuff I do, so thank you very much for reminding me of that. I guess I didn't realize how much you've already thought about CRT as an institution. Anyway, there was a panel. I knew there was a panel a few weeks ago, but I wasn't quite sure how in-depth it was. I am going to go over CRT, what it is not. If you're hearing anything you've already heard, I do apologize, but I can safely assume that I'm going to add some information you probably haven't heard. Anyone who knows me knows that two things drive my writing and research, and they both reflect my lamentations about the state of academia. One thing is the state of higher education in general, and my field of rhetoric and composition specifically. Social justice has transformed the field so much that, at times, it scarcely resembles the study of rhetoric at all. The other thing is the representation of Black people in academia and how that representation shapes interpretations of, expectations of, and behavior toward Black students and faculty. I should disclose from the beginning that I am not entirely content with much, if not all, of contemporary anti-racism, specifically the kind most associated with the term critical race theory, which I'll be calling CRT throughout the speech. But what is CRT? Well, I hope to make that clear by the end of the talk. I want to define CRT, define what we are seeing in anti-racist activist circles, which is not entirely CRT, and show how the brand of anti-racism manifests, this brand of CRT. Ultimately, I hope you leave here today with a better idea of what people would take issue with regarding House Bill 1532, or Pennsylvania's, quote, Teaching Racial and Universal Equality Act. I believe that is right here, which says nothing about really banning CRT. What it does say is this: no communication by a Commonwealth, county, or municipal agency, school district, or public post-secondary institution, or an official representative shall adopt, express, or promote any racist or sexist concept. This raises a question. What is a racist or sexist concept? Well, here they are. You can look for yourself. Who would have a problem with this and why? I hope to answer that question by the end of this talk. But first, I'll let you take a look at these. Now, one would think that there is nothing wrong and everything right with these concepts, but things have changed. That does depend on the lens through which you see this. There are various lenses, various, Kenneth Burke called them terministic screens. The way we look at things, we select certain things and deflect other things. We all do this. We can't get away from it. The only thing we can do is acknowledge that we do it. And I think there are several different terministic screens through which we are looking at these concepts. Here are some of the others. So, what is critical race theory, or CRT? Let's go over its definitions and salient terms. Critical race theory is, according to seminal scholars Richard Delgado and Jean Stefancic, a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among races, racism, and power. Here are the main tenets. Systemic racism. Race is a social construct. Intersectionality, or look for the other question. I will go over all these momentarily. Interest convergence. Distrust in classical liberal values, which include individuality, primacy of reason, free speech, marketplace of ideas, colorblindness, meritocracy, and other things I will also go over later in the talk. Storytelling / lived experience as a primary way of knowing. And these ideas are represented by scholars Derek Bell, Mari Matsuda, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Jean Stefancic, and so many others. This list gives the gist of CRT, but it is important to parse out the ideas that constitute critical race theory in order to better understand its quarrelsome relationship to classical liberalism and how this contentiousness manifests in academic spaces. Initially, we should acknowledge that the word racism itself has gone through some significant changes. Racism now goes beyond the errant behavior of individuals ragefully screaming the N-word in traffic, for example, or a parent adamantly disapproving of a child's interracial relationship. It's gone beyond that. The very concept of racism has been re-signified. Racism, according to the revised definition, only happens as the confluence of discrimination and power. Thus, only racial discrimination from a dominant source or a hegemonic source counts as racist. Anything else is considered mere discrimination, if considered at all, and often praised as punching upward or speaking truth to power. Here, the distinction between classical liberalism and illiberalism of contemporary anti-racism becomes a little clearer. The former condemns racial discrimination outright. The latter condemns racial discrimination only when it comes from certain places, i.e. Eurocentric and often male sources. Excuse me. As stated earlier, critical race theorists generally believe that racism is not an aberration, but the norm, as is explained through terms like structural racism, implicit bias, so on. Systemic racism describes the inherent racism throughout society. The closely related institutional racism simply denotes the racial discrimination built into institutions, from the legal system to education. Implicit bias is the idea that most white people harbor racist ideas because they were socially constructed within structural racism. So, when many critical race theorists say the word racism, they are speaking of structural, institutional, or implicit racism. Overt acts of racial discrimination are rarely addressed. What structural racism, institutional racism, and implicit bias have in common is that they present racism as a system of normal, everyday occurrences that happen because society was structured to make sure that they happen. Another commonality between the terms, perhaps most controversial, is that every racial disparity and misfortune that befalls racial minorities is attributed to these concepts. Structural racism, institutional racism, and implicit bias are the cause of most of the ills that beset people of color. This takes agency and culpability away from minorities and places it onto society. This is why equality of opportunity, a classical liberal concept, is de-emphasized in exchange for equality of outcome. The former concept is considered inherently racist because it ignores the obstacles put in front of people of color by society and the institutions therein. Equality of outcome, then, is seen as the better option. CRT puts forth the idea that race is a social construct, molded by white hegemony for the benefit of white people. White supremacy is considered a purposeful methodology that puts forth whiteness as common sense normality, so fortified that any legal acts made to benefit people of color are looked upon suspiciously. This brings us to the concept of interest convergence, a belief that hegemony only helps the downtrodden when it is in the hegemonic best interest to do so. The concept of interest convergence frames any policy said to benefit people of color not only as suspicious, but also as potentially insidious as a tool of white supremacy. Next, critical race theorists claim to shun the idea of essentialism and embrace anti-essentialism that does not pigeonhole people into particular sets of characteristics based on race. This reflects the general belief among critical race theorists that race is a social construct and nothing real. Thus, the stereotypes of black people held by whites and other hegemonic parties are groundless and based on the desire to uphold white supremacy. CRT's embrace of anti-essentialism correlates with the concept of intersectionality, a term coined by the seminal CRT scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, which describes the fact that a person does not harbor an essential and one-dimensional identity, but is a cross-section of several identities. We can see here that essentialism cannot work if we take into consideration the multidimensional identities held by many. For instance, a person may be a woman, but because she is a black woman, she does not have the same issues as a white woman, and therefore will have different needs and goals when it comes to feminist social justice. Based on the concept of intersectionality, Mari Matsuda asked those interested in social justice to always ask the other question. Matsuda writes, quote, "When I see something that looks racist, I ask, where is the patriarchy in this? When I see something that looks sexist, I ask, where is the heterosexism in this? And where is the racism? When I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where are the class interests in this? Working in coalition forces us to look for both the obvious and non-obvious relationships of domination, helping us to realize that no form of subordination ever stands alone," unquote. In the spirit of intersectionality, the other question is a prompt to look for those intersections to see if other aspects of personhood are relevant to a particular circumstance. These are the general tenets of CRT, yet proponents of CRT are not necessarily monolithic. An important ideological split can be gleaned among CRT scholars. That split within CRT is between the idealist and the realist. For the idealist, racism is a matter of thinking and rhetoric, which is to say it is a social construct that can be remade into a more favorable discourse through resignification of terms and the reframing of social phenomena. The other faction within CRT is the realist group, which dominated CRT's beginnings and includes its founding theorists. Also known as racial materialism, racial realism insists that racism is the result of material structures that decide how resources are allocated. Both idealist and realist CRT dismiss classical liberalism for its incrementalism and its colorblindness and its meritocracy and so on. Although both the idealist and realist manifestations of CRT are found in academia, for example, language policing, admission protocols, respectively, the idealist wing has emerged as the executive ideology. Called left mysticism by some, when applied to contemporary social justice in general, the idealist disposition is a game of language and symbolism. Writers like Gertrude Ambrose, Francis Fukuyama, and critical race theorist Richard Delgado lament that the idealist faction of CRT proponents, prominently found in academia, seem to be consistent harvesters of the low-hanging fruit of language and symbolism. Delgado suggests that this turn has happened because the critique of a word or an image is less daunting and often more lucrative than critiquing the general makeup of oppressive state apparatuses. If the idealist turn came about for its abundance of low-hanging fruit and symbolic gestures, we may get a clue as to why those discussions of race in academia are so contentious. We may also get some insight into why many self-described CRT scholars insist that CRT is not present in K through 12 education. Perhaps what they mean to say is realist CRT is not present in K through 12 education. We may be seeing CRT idealism in pedagogical manifestations of the theory. However, I think the ultimate clue regarding the idealist turn, which is a turn away from the realist take on CRT, comes from the person who is lauded both as a founding figure of CRT and one considered by many to be a realist within the genre. And this is Derek Bell. More specifically, Bell's foundational essay, Racial Realism, discussed more thoroughly in the book's introduction of the Introduction to Critical Race Theory by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic, provides insight. It provides the best understanding of CRT's contemporary manifestations in workplaces and schools. So, Bell writes, quote, "Black people will never gain full equality in this country. Even those Herculean efforts we hail as successful will produce no more than temporary peaks of progress, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance." Unquote. To be clear, this sentiment, what Bell calls confusingly racial realism, is, quote, "a mindset or philosophy that requires us to acknowledge the permanence of our subordinate status. That acknowledgement enables us to avoid despair and frees us to imagine and implement racial strategies that can bring fulfillment and even triumph." Unquote. Why would accepting subordination bring fulfillment and triumph? Perhaps because the new goal is not actual change toward racial equality, but the dignity that comes in speaking truth to power for its own sake. Or, sadly, the alleviation of pressure that comes with the idea that one's failures are never one's own fault. Ironically, racial realism seems to de-emphasize the realist take on CRT and settles for the moral victory of standing up in the face of oppression. For Bell, faith in true racial inequality, or racial equality and integration are the ideals, but the reality is that these things will never happen. What saves racial realism from being nihilistic is its ability to help people of color tread societal waters while providing a sense of pride in facing an enemy standing up as opposed to on one's knees. Bell explains further, quote, "Continued struggle can bring about unexpected benefits and gains that in themselves justify continued endeavor. The fight in itself has meaning and should give us hope for the future." What could Bell mean when he writes that the fight has meaning and should give us hope for the future? If one were to observe circles of anti-racist activism, one may notice that its primary teloi of anti-racist activism are the acquisition of a sense of dignity, the avoidance of despair, and, according to Bell, the satisfaction of perceived empowerment derived from making one's oppressors as uncomfortable as possible. Add to Bell's theory the belief among many CRT activists and scholars that racism is foundational to the existing order of things, and illiberal claims that Western civilization is irredeemably racist make more sense, as does the reading of the House bill as racist and censorious. This dignity grab, that's what I call it, may be the impetus for much contemporary anti-racism, but what makes it even more detrimental is its relationship to resentment. Fukuyama writes, quote, "In a wide variety of cases, a political leader has mobilized followers around the perception that the group's dignity had been affronted, disparaged, or otherwise disregarded. This resentment engenders demands for public recognition of the dignity of the group in question. A humiliated group seeking restitution of its dignity carries far more emotional weight than people simply pursuing their economic advantage," unquote. Therefore, those who feel such humiliation don't see redemption in classical liberalism. After all, the perceived humiliation took place under the aegis of classical liberalism. Others, often those more aligned with individuality than group affiliation, are less prone to feel this humiliation. Individualism, which happens to be one of the salient tenets of classical liberalism, is a kind of inoculation to group humiliation, and by extension, the politics of resentment. Fukuyama continues, quote, "Identity grows in the first place out of a distinction between one's true inner self and an outer world of social rules and norms that does not adequately recognize that inner self's worth or dignity. Individuals throughout human history have found themselves at odds with their societies. It is not the inner self that has to be made to conform to society's rules, but society itself that needs to change," unquote. Now, I want to be clear that I like aspects of critical race theory. I think intersectionality is an accurate way of seeing the world and individuals. I think Mori Matsuda's asking the other question can help enhance scrutiny when thinking critically. What's more, we should investigate economic and educational disparities between races, or the wage disparity among whites and people of color with the same levels of education. We should explore housing. We should, CRT pushes us to look into things a little more deeply. CRT, which is derived from critical legal studies, can push us to investigate the overrepresentation of minorities in the prison system. Storytelling, in the right context, is a powerful way to make a point. These ideas are beneficial parts of CRT. What's more, there are some very, very problematic textbooks in K through 12 who, at best, are whitewashing some of the things that happen in history, which is why a lot of people equate CRT with the teaching of history. But as you just heard, hopefully, CRT is so much more than the teaching of history. Many contemporary anti-racists seem to look at CRT from a different angle from the one I just tried to describe. One that seems to emphasize its illiberalism and what Matthew Iglesias may call generalized aversion to hierarchy and discipline, and uses a substantial dose of postmodernism to damage the entirety of American hegemony. These same contemporary anti-racists embrace the aforementioned left mysticism and favor idealism over reality. They are less likely to converse across differences or entertain other viewpoints. These contemporary anti-racists seem to see CRT not as a theory, but as a dogma universally applied. These contemporary anti-racists have drifted far enough from CRT even farther than the aforementioned idealist, to warrant a different label altogether. Critical social justice, a concept distinct from but derived from CRT, is the theory and pedagogy under much contentiousness in American society. Critical social justice, or as I'll say, CSJ, most commonly attributed to Robin DiAngelo and her sometimes partner Özlem Şensoy, was coined in their attempt to, quote, distinguish their standpoint of social justice from the mainstream standpoints. They explain, quote, a critical approach to social justice refers to specific theoretical perspectives that recognize that society is stratified, that is, divided and unequal, in significant and far-reaching ways along social group lines that include race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. Maybe I should show that to you. Critical social justice recognizes inequality as deeply embedded in the fabric of society, that is, as structural, and actively seeks to change this, unquote. Clearly, if CSJ is not synonymous with CRT, it surely derives from CRT. So CSJ shares some of the pros of CRT, but the cons of CSJ derive from a twisting of CRT's tenets into something more blatantly illiberal. CSJ differs from CRT in ways that include an emphasis on dogmatism, postmodern thought, and reductionist ideas. It puts more emphasis on group membership than individuality, and sees the world as a struggle between immutable, oppressed, and oppressors. One can conclude that what most people call CRT may actually be anti-racist CSJ. So I want to stop there and go off script a little bit. I think that that is true. I think when people say CRT isn't in schools, they're right, but they're kind of missing the point. I often use the analogy of a wild, rabid, carnivorous, big cat chasing you. And you're screaming, there's a tiger chasing me, there's a tiger. And somebody with a tranquilizer gun is there who can stop this thing from eating you, but he notices that it's not a tiger, it's a lion. So he says, he's lying, it's not a tiger. There's no tiger chasing him. And the guy gets eaten, all right? Yes, maybe it's not CRT, but it's something that we should probably be looking into. And a lot of the people who say that's not CRT should be saying that's not CRT, however, it is something problematic, so we should do something about it. I think it says something that we don't hear that enough. Now, back to the show. The tenets of CSJ constitute a large list of ideas that work as a collective screen through which we can, or according to some must, see the world, including state bills and things like that. These tenets are as follows. Racism exists today in both traditional and modern forms. Racism is institutionalized, multi-layered, multi-level systems that distributes unequal power and resources between white people and people of color as socially identified and disproportionately benefits whites. All members of society are socialized to participate in the system of racism, albeit within varied social locations. All white people benefit from racism regardless of intentions. No one chose to be socialized into racism, so no one is bad, but no one is neutral. To not act against racism is to support racism. Racism must be continually identified, analyzed, and challenged. No one is ever done. The racial status quo is comfortable for most whites. Therefore, anything that maintains white comfort is suspect. The racially oppressed have a more intimate insight via experiential knowledge of the system of race than their racial oppressors. White professors will be seen as having more legitimacy Thus, positionality must be intentionally engaged. Resistance is a predictable reaction to any anti-racist education and must be explicitly and strategically addressed. And my favorite, the question is not did racism take place, but rather how did racism manifest in that situation? Something more is happening here than the mere dignity grab I talked about earlier. With CSJ, one may see what theologian Tad DeLay refers to as the cynic, not someone who constantly scrutinizes, although that is definitely part of it. DeLay defines cynics as a person who is unconcerned with your opinions so long as they don't hamper his efforts. A group that shows, quote, a disregard for those they will harm, unquote. The cynic person or group exhibits behavior, quote, less like perceptiveness and more like nihilism, who don't care about the truth and use people as means to an end, unquote. Cynics are happy to use people to achieve their goals, which they pursue by any means necessary. I believe that critical social justice is a cynical ideology in the sense that DeLay describes it. And I think its origin in critical theory, and therefore Marxist thought, is significant. Critical theory is the work of a Marxist think tank called the Frankfurt School, which began before World War II, but had to relocate to the US during the war so its members could escape persecution. Critical theory, a decidedly counter-hegemonic and explicitly Marxist view of the world, would eventually lead to critical legal studies, which would give birth to critical race theory in the 70s and early 80s. In fact, founders of CRT, like Delgado, freely admit their Marxist leanings. Its latest progeny is critical social justice. CSJ's emergence may just be the latest observation of the long march through institutions embarked upon by many a Marxist and Marxist sympathizer. Now, I'm not going to trace CSJ's implicit Marxism in this talk, but still, I sound like a conspiracy theorist when I do it. But if you follow the research, it's clearly there. That's a different talk. I won't do it. But today, I do want to show you how CSJ may manifest in ways that sound like Marxism sometimes. And I'll do it soon. But first, let's talk about some pedagogical manifestations of CSJ. This is from a school in Reno, Nevada. The slide is what it is. You can take a look at it right here. It talks about the importance of identity and gives a lot of weight to identity. This way of looking at identity I will talk about momentarily. I just wanted to show this to you. The idea that reverse racism isn't a thing, and oppressive attitudes and behaviors are backed by institutional arrangements. We see that in CRT. Some people of color can have prejudices against white people. However, these prejudices are severely punished. Maybe, maybe not. Therefore, the oppressed groups do not have the power to enforce prejudices, unlike the dominant group who does have the power. In my opinion, that is a bit reductionist, but again, we can talk about that a little bit later. This is a pathway to equitable math instruction. Dismantling racism in mathematics instruction. Now, there are some tenets here to this document that I can go over. Actually, they're right here. And I'll just gloss them quickly. So, what is equitable math? A focus on getting the right answer is perfectionism, or either-or thinking. The idea that teachers are teachers and students are learners is wrong. To think of it as a problem that the expectations you have of a student are not met is racist. To teach math in a linear fashion with skills taught in sequence is racist. To value procedural fluency, that is, knowing how to do fractions, long division, etc., over conceptual knowledge is racist. I can go on. Those are the summaries of the linguist John McWhorter, who has the same issues I have with this document. The idea that math is racist is racist. Then there's this from my field. Black linguistic justice. Teaching a student of color, especially a black student, standard English is inherently racist. You are pushing Eurocentric values onto that person. Forget about the practical and pragmatic value of knowing an English deemed standard, or what Geneva Smitherman would call a language of wider communication. If you force somebody to say isn't instead of ain't, you are a bigot. Oh, getting ahead of myself. So, with that in mind, Black linguistic justice, I want to talk to you about something that happened in my field recently. About a month ago, month and a half. At the 2022 Conference on College Composition and Communication, the flagship conference in my field, the field of rhetoric and composition, prominent scholars participated in a panel on proper learning outcomes and anti-racist teaching practices. The panel involved a discussion on allowing students in first-year writing classes, which are mandatory in most institutions, to write in what is called a home dialect or code-meshed English. The former refers to a non-mainstream dialect that is the preferred mode of communication in a student's home environment, and the latter is a synthesis of a student's home dialect with a more standardized English. So you mesh the two, code meshing. According to the panelists and many others in the field, teaching standardized English to students of color, especially black students, is inherently racist and oppressive. In order to achieve quote-unquote linguistic justice, therefore, it is believed that students must be allowed to write in their home dialects. Excuse me. Anti-racist scholars see code meshing as the way people really talk and write, ignoring the fact that the effective communication is contextual. Whether discussing home dialect, code mesh English, or standard English, what is most useful is in one context may not be in another. Context is an important aspect of rhetorical theory and practice. And yet many panelists at the conference emphasized home dialects and code meshing while neglecting context as well as audience and subject matter, making rhetoric less about effective communication and more about self-expression, a dignity grab, perhaps. For those who may have difficulty believing that this is truly happening, the following question was posed during a Zoom Q&A session after a panel presentation by a professor concerned about the resistance he was experiencing from his minority student. So the panel's over. It was about this, basically, and how we need to change first-year writing so that it reflects linguistic justice. And a professor in the audience, the Zoom audience, asked this question. What do we do with their resistance to code meshing? For example, in our writing classrooms, when it comes from BIPOC students, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, I ask because my attempts to encourage students to use their home dialects in writing, Black students in particular, often resist those practices as setting them up for failure. Go figure. Which only reflects how ingrained they are in a system that is inherently racist, that they become unable to trust efforts to resist standard American English as the only way of writing and composing. So, this person sees these students who want to learn what is called standard English because they think it's valuable. They took the class for a reason, although it is mandatory. They are there to get a general liberal arts education, and he's seeing this as them being brainwashed. Their minds are colonized. I'm just going off script now. This is where I get a little too passionate, so I'm just gonna. What? I mean, what's been happening in the past 8 to 10 years? Oh, this, yes. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. For a long time. So. This stuff fucking worked until, like, what? A couple months ago? Okay. It's getting exciting. All right. So, the response to that professor's question, or concern rather, is this. Now, there is a prominent professor in the field, and I talk about him not to attack him personally. I feel like I have to say that these days. I am expressing a concern with what he says, with the things that he publishes, right? And with his clear disdain for hegemony and his clear embrace of Marxist principles. He says that himself. He's very proud of it. So this is not speculation. His response to that professor is rather long, but I think it's worth looking at in full, or almost full. He says, I hear a real savvy student thinking, I came here just to get stuff to succeed. I, as a teacher, don't want to take that from that student. I also feel like this is a really shitty choice. I have to create a classroom and a learning experience that demeans the long linguistic history of that student in order for that student to go into the world and go into unfair, racist, white supremacist systems and succeed. Furthermore, I have to accept, this is going to sound bad, but I'll explain why, the selfish motivations of that student to succeed. Only because if that student says, you're setting me up for failure, what they're saying is, I want to succeed in that system, I want to game that system. That's okay, but I think it's an immature goal in some ways. He continues. There are so many bigger things in the world we should be striving for, and perhaps our students just aren't quite at that moment in their lives, yet in their life. And that's okay, and maybe they just haven't been exposed, because what they've been exposed to is capitalist-inflicted bullshit about education being the way in which we get to become a nice little cog in the system, and you get skills. And I continue a little bit here. So, you go out into the world and make Microsoft more money. I don't want to do that. I don't want to augment that. I want them to be fully actualized people that do stuff in the world to change it and make it better for everyone else. I'll continue to go by the script. Inouye's reply gives us much to unpack. For him, a primary importance is placed on a writer's authenticity and the dignifying of Black identity through writing. In this view, the audience and the recognition of the best means with which to communicate with them matters much less than the writer's proud and authentic self-expression. While there is nothing wrong with proud and authentic self-expression, it should not be the executive focus of a first-year course requirement designed to teach students how to effectively communicate their thoughts with a wide audience through writing. Other classes are available for that. Another concern is how this emphasis shapes the prevailing image of Black students in rhetoric and composition. which manifests itself in Inouye's characterization of black students who want to learn standard English. In his estimation, these students are nothing more than ignorant dupes in an exploitative system, and their desire to learn is nothing more than the internalization of their own racial oppression. Indeed, the idea that people cannot be self-actualized in this system is a principle of Marxist sentiment. These students lack any agency to make this choice of their own volition. Instead, they become, as Inouye puts it, nice little cogs in the system. Inouye's response reveals a number of other issues that are indicative of broader trends. Firstly, Inouye assumes that all black students have a visceral connection to the linguistic history of their racial categorization, an assumption that is itself racist. That's a part that I didn't include here. Inouye fails to recognize that he is, in fact, participating in what anthropologist Michael Engelke calls linguistic naturalism, or the ideology of authenticity, which is, quote, based on essentialism and suggests that our language expresses something integral to who we are, both individually and corporately. Inouye fails to entertain the notion that language may be a non-essential part of one's identity, or that it is only important insofar as it is useful as a tool for communicating with other people in a given context. Inouye, whether he realizes it or not, projects an identity onto his black students because they are black, that views language as naturally and necessarily intertwined with identity. In so doing, Inouye assumes that viewing individual black students through the lens of what he believes is black people's shared linguistic history, regardless of whether these students feel this connection themselves, is an obviously noble and necessary educational endeavor. Secondly, Inouye calls the black students' desire to learn standard English selfish and immature. That is, he believes that striving to learn standard English, rather than rejecting it completely in favor of a home dialect or code meshing, reveals a lack of ability to empathize with the many black people who are not willing or able to succeed within America's white supremacist system. He views this as an immature goal, assuming that a mature goal involves not only seeing the world as he does, a mental and emotional obstacle course held up by racist systems and institutions, but also following him in working to transform society into a place where individual goals are always subordinate to group outcomes. Based on Inouye's academic work, it is hardly surprising that he would believe this. In fact, he views selfishness, or hyper-individualism, as a constitutive aspect of what he calls habits of white language. Inouye writes, hyper-individualism is a stance or judgment that primarily values self-determination and autonomy as most important or most valued. It often centers or assumes values of the self as an individual, self-reliance, self-sufficiency, and self-control. Thus, the best outcome of a class or an assignment or activity is something personal, a personal grade, a personal insight or learning, a better draft, but not a benefit to the community, group, or class as a whole. Reminiscent of the now infamous white aspects of whiteness flyer from the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Inouye sees several vices in what many, I dare say most, would call virtues. In Above the Well, an anti-racist literacy argument from a boy of color, a half memoir, half argument for linguistic justice, Inouye writes that individuality, rationality, self-control, clarity, and order are aspects of white spaces and are therefore confining to people of color who find themselves in them. I should say that Inouye is a person of color, but he is not black, he is Japanese. In a textbook example of defeatism and fatalism, Inouye has also insisted later in his response that minority students and minorities in general are doomed in American society. Regarding minority students' use of education as a large step in pursuing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Inouye said, quote, "It's never going to be enough, man. You're going to go out and you're always still going to be black, or you're always still going to be Latinx, or you're always still going to be something else. That's just not quite it. You can mouth the words that are white, but they're never gonna dash, they're coming from a black body." I want to reiterate that my interpretation of Inouye's problematic answer to an already problematic question reflects the devolution of my field and the infantilization and victimization of black students. That being said, I would rather not conclude that Inouye and those scholars who think like them are evil and only out for themselves. Inouye may be sincere about the efficacy of his pedagogical goals, but how can we make sense of Inouye's stance? What frame of reference would justify Inouye's statements? Well, I think we can return to classical liberalism for that. And we can also return, or I will return anyway, to what's called the theory of empowerment. I think the confluence of that theory and classical liberal values are themselves social justice, and if done right, can solve a lot of problems. I'm going to skip a little bit now. I'm sensing that I'm butting up against the end. Okay, what time is it? Oh, okay. So in that case, I will go way off script and just talk to you. All right. So, well, I'll still use this a little bit. So, in my research, what I've come to realize is that what's happening here is that we too quickly try to get groups of people to get along. What we don't do is have people explore themselves. Self-awareness, self-management, all these are aspects of what's called empowerment theory. Empowerment theory is a theory that has three components: the intrapersonal, which is, inner empowerment; the interactional, which is basically knowledge of one's environment and how to get along therein; and the behavioral, how to collaborate together to get things done. I think the problem with a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and by extension, CSJ and education and things like that, is that we are skipping the intrapersonal and going straight to the interactional, which is to say we're skipping getting to know ourselves and we're going straight to how can we all get along. This is a problem because without emotional self-awareness, emotional self-control, what we do is we bring a lot of baggage with us to the situation. And that baggage has a lot to do with tribalism, thinking we're right and how could this person think what this person actually thinks. What we don't realize is that we, just like that other person, just like those other people, have been socially constructed in ways that help us or have us look at the world in a certain way. I talked earlier about Kenneth Burke's concept of deterministic screens. We all look at the world and we choose based on our upbringing, based on the values, attitudes, and beliefs that we've come to learn. We have certain values, we select certain things, and we deselect other things. Simply recognizing that can help us get along, right? Simply recognizing that we do that and everybody else does that can help us get along. When we do that, we are better able to receive that person as he or she is, right? Not as we imagine them to be before we even walked into the room. I think a lot of that is what's happening here. And I think that empowerment theory, intrapersonal, the interactional, social awareness, and behavioral, working together toward a common goal, has a lot to do with classical liberalism. These are some major tenets, the normal tenets of classical liberalism. And you will see individualism there. Individualism is quite under attack these days. In no way, it's not the only one. In this conference that I talked about, individualism came up as kind of a vice and not a virtue in several panels. Some more. But what I want to point to you are two different definitions of classical liberalism and how they kind of overlap with empowerment theory and therefore, in my mind, social justice. Just two, and I'll be done. This is from Helen Pluckrose, who is the founder of an organization called Counterweight, which is there to advocate for people who have been attacked for, well, doing things like valuing individualism. And she says this. We define, you can read it. You can read it right there, and what she sees here, what you can see here, is how classical liberalism, if done right, is social justice. Now, you can say, well, what about all the material issues going on? The residual effects of redlining, right? The poor educational facilities, right? Institutions that we have in certain environments and things like that. Well, that is where the third component of empowerment comes into play, the behavioral. The behavioral is a collaboration of people with what's called a superordinate goal. You can have very different groups, but they have one goal and they need to work together to fulfill that. Dealing with those things has to happen at the local level. And it has to happen organically at a grassroots situation, and it has to embrace empowerment theory, and it has to look at classical liberalism in this way. Francis Fukuyama, who I've mentioned already, has this to say about classical liberalism. And I'm going to read this one because I just want to. Classical liberalism can best be understood as an institutional solution to the problem of governing our diversity. Or to put it in slightly different terms, it is a system for peacefully managing diversity in pluralistic societies. The most fundamental principle enshrined in liberalism is one of tolerance. You do not have to agree with your fellow citizens about the most important things, but only that each individual should get to decide what those things are without interference from you or from the state. That is individualism. All right? It's not this egregious selfishness. It's not just looking out for yourself and not being concerned about other people. It's the freedom to make these choices. And yes, one can say nobody is truly individual. Of course, not at an ontological level, nobody is an individual. No man is an island, right? We are all interdependent in some way. But we do have the choice to choose which context in which we'll be interdependent. That is individualism. We can choose that we want to learn standard English because it might benefit us one day, right? It might come in handy when you have to write that memo to your boss, right? And if you want to be a boss, you should probably have a firm grasp of this dialect. But that is what is meant by individualism. So, to quickly summarize the last part of this talk, I firmly believe in empowerment theory because it helps us know ourselves before we try to know other people, and then subsequently work together to make the world a better place. And I think that if we apply empowerment theory to classical liberalism, what we have is empowered liberalism. And I think that's what Helen Pluckrose and Francis Fukuyama are talking about, and I think that's what we need to move toward. Now I'm done. Yeah.
We will now begin the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking a question. We reserve the first question for students, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the audience. We'll now take the first question.
How was that thorough? Great.
All right, we can open it up to the rest of the audience. It's for the
Understood. Hey, yeah, so I'm a welder, and both sides of this Ukraine conflict are blowing each other up with tanks. What side am I supposed to be taking?
Is that a real question?
Yeah, it's confusing.
Oh, you might be at the wrong presentation?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, hopefully. We all got to select the service numbers.
Well, I honestly, I'm still trying to figure out what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, all I know is that I'm siding with the Ukrainians.
That's kind of a loaded statement.
Which one, yours or mine?
No, I mean like Ukrainians, because they don't even agree with themselves.
Well, true. Yes, that actually is true. Nevertheless, wait a minute. I don't know. I haven't done research on this. I've been a bit busy, so I haven't been as knowledgeable as I would like to be with that. So that is my answer.
Thanks for coming. I'm over here. Thanks for coming. If you could be that little imaginary figure on the shoulder of Judge Brown Jackson when Ted Cruz was grilling her, would you have whispered something in her ear to say something different, or were you satisfied with her answers to his questions?
I was satisfied with her answer simply because whatever answer she gave wasn't going to be good enough for Ted Cruz. I mean, that's the theater that was going on there at the time. I think issues like 1619, right? This idea of CRT as the boogeyman of the right wing and things like that has already poisoned the well, to the point where no matter what she said, she was going to be in trouble from somebody, right? I think she handled that entire thing quite nicely. And that alone makes me admire her. I already knew she was the person for the job, right? She is quite competent, and I look forward to seeing her on the court. But, I mean, long story short, she did what she had to do. Again, that was theater. That was for show. And she dealt with it, and now she's a Supreme Court justice. Yes?
I understand that classical liberalism is something you believe in strongly, and it's also a founding tenet of the United States. Mm-hmm. So how do you believe that should be taught, and at what point in the education system should classical liberalism be part of curriculums?
Well, I think even if we don't talk about it explicitly, there are certain principles, right, that we can talk about or instill in students at a young age, like self-awareness, self-management, the things that go with individualism, a primacy of reason, not the suppression of emotion. That's not what it is, all right? Francis Bacon famously said that rhetoric, my field, is the applying of reason to the imagination for the better moving of the will. And what he meant by that is that if we can have our emotions, but not let them overtake us, we will be better able to contribute to society, right? We will be better able to communicate with one another. These are things that are good in and of themselves. We don't have to say, okay, classical liberalism is these things. We can just talk about those things, right? We can talk about the concept of equality. Remember that? Remember when that was good? I do. We can talk about those things. We have here the goal of life in this world is happiness, human flourishing, and well-being. No need to say the words classical or liberalism. Those are good things, right? So if we can just embrace the individual tenets now and again, right? I don't think there is a grade too young for some of these. That's it. All right.
I actually also have a question. In relation to CSJ, how do you suppose, like you just said, equality is a great thing. Do you suppose that we can get back to a place of using these critical social justice skills and what you're calling the better aspects of it? How do we continue to push those and emphasize those aspects without the aspects that you disagree with?
Okay, so I'm going to try to reword what you said and say, how can we save CRT from CSJ? Right?
Sure.
Yeah, is that because CSJ is kind of a bastardization of CRT, right? For example, the intersectionality thing that I said was a good idea, that's been twisted by CSJ into the person with the most downtrodden intersections is the person who has the most right to speak, right? That's not exactly what was meant by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she came out and said so much a few years ago. So these kind of things, just not twisting things to go a little too far. Mari Matsuda's asking the other question, which helps us scrutinize things better and more thoroughly. That's been turned into, it's not whether racism happened, but how it manifested in this situation, right? Which is a dangerous tenet. So what I would like to do with these kind of things, ultimately, and this is an overarching thing, besides the things I just mentioned, is realize that critical race theory is indeed a theory, right? It's a way of looking at the world that may or may not be accurate in certain contexts. CSJ, on the other hand, is a dogma, right? This is the way it is. If you question that, you're racist, right? There was a tenet of CSJ, pardon me here. Resistance is a predictable reaction to anti-racist education and must be explicitly and strategically addressed. That doesn't sound horrible, but what it does, it manifests as, if you're questioning this, that's proof of your racism, something that D'Angelo says often in her books and her articles and things like that. That has to go. All right? The idea that critical race theory is a theory needs to be embraced and emphasized over and over again. CSJ is not a theory, it is a dogma.
All right, that concludes this evening's presentation. Please join me in thanking Eric Smith.